And we're live. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our part 2 of this Google Hangout series talking about drug discovery. Last time we talked about how we discover new drugs. This time we're talking about how we actually get those drugs into new patients. And joining me is my co-host, Emma Smith. Hi, Emma. How are you?
Hello. I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm glad we can see and hear each other. And Emma, this is confusing because we have two Emmas in this hangout. So there's Emma Dean. Hi, Emma Dean.
Hello, everyone.
And then there's Diane, who's joining us as well. Could the two of you please introduce yourself, and then we can get started straight to the questions.
Okay, so I'm Dr. Emma Dean. I'm a medical oncologist. I work at the Christie Hospital at Manchester, and my specialty is to run the clinical trials in cancer patients.
And Diane?
Hi everybody, I'm Diane and I'm actually a patient at the Christie Hospital and I've been on a number of clinical trials at the Christie.
Cool. Emma Smith, do you want to kick things off?
Certainly, Buddhini. Thanks for the introduction. So, as Buddhini mentioned in the first part of the Google Hangout, we discovered about how scientists, researchers are turning bright ideas in the lab into new medicines. But that's only the first hurdle. What happens next? How do we start this process of testing a new drug in patients for the first time? So we're going to go straight to Emma Dean. Hi, Emma. You're a specialist in a clinical trials unit. So can you begin by kicking the session off, just telling us a broad overview about clinical trials, what they're aiming to achieve?
Yes, so overall, the aim with clinical trials is to bring new drugs from the laboratory into the clinic in a very safe and structured way. And this means sifting out drugs that don't work, or drugs that have troublesome side effects, or actually no better than the drugs that we have already. And what that leaves us with are the drugs which are promising, and we want to accelerate the development of those drugs so they get to the point where they're licensed and where they are widely available for as many patients as possible.
So I keep hearing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Can you explain a little bit about what the different phases are and why is it broken up like that?
Yes, this can often cause some confusion. There are different phases in terms of clinical trials, and this goes back to what I was just explaining in terms of the design being very structured and how we get patients into how we get drugs into patients. And the starting point is taking a drug that has been tested in the laboratory and shown some promise in the laboratory. And the first and most important thing we do when we give a new drug to patients is to check that it's safe. We also want to make sure that patients can tolerate the drug and work out the best way to give the treatment. And this is what we call a phase 1 trial, and is often the first time we give a new drug to patients. So that's a phase 1 trial. The next stage is a phase 2 trial, and this is where we test the drugs in more patients and usually identify the cancer type that we expect to see the greatest benefit. In these trials, we are trying to show that the drug works in that particular cancer type. Finally, in a phase 3 trial, we are comparing that new treatment to the best existing treatment, usually in a head-to-head comparison, to find out if it's better than what we already use. And it's only when a phase 3 trial is positive that we can take that drug forward for licensing for it to be prescribed routinely. The problem with this approach is that it can be very slow, with the vast majority of drugs never actually making it to licensing.
So how long would it take on average?
Well, it can take up to 10 years from a drug really from phase 1 trial to actually being licensed and widely available. Yeah. And what we're trying to do all the time is speed up that process and increase our chances of success. So we're now actually in drug development beginning to move away from those 3 separate phases and spending a lot more time learning about the way the drug works at the earliest opportunity. And the reason we're doing this is that we want to stop the development of drugs which have poor prospects and actually focus all of our energies on the drugs which have the greatest chance of success. And this also means we are trying to select patients based on their tumour characteristics who are most likely to respond well to an individual drug. And we call that concept personalised medicine or precision medicine.
Yeah. It's because every cancer is unique and every patient's cancer is unique, so there is no one-size-fits-all treatment really.
Absolutely, and so sometimes when a patient is referred to take part in a trial, we do spend some time trying to understand their individual cancer before we suggest a trial opportunity for them.
Yeah. So.
Emma. Yeah. Sorry, Buddhini. Emma, just a quick question. Are all the phases the same size then? And how many people take part in a clinical trial?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in a phase 1 trial, we typically don't treat huge numbers of patients because the endpoints are looking at safety and how well the drug is tolerated. So we don't want to expose too many patients altogether to a new drug. We actually often stagger treating patients or treat small groups of patients and observe them for a period of time before we recruit the next group of patients. A phase 2 trial typically would have, say, between 50 and 100 patients, and a phase 3 trial can be much, much larger. And that brings its own challenges in terms of recruitment, because each phase has their own emphasis, really. But what we're seeing now is actually, as I mentioned, we're spending a lot more time trying to understand the drug at the earlier phase. And actually, some of the phase 1 trials we're seeing now can involve hundreds of patients, whilst we try and understand not only, is the drug safe and tolerated, but which patients to give it to, which cancer types, and trying to understand how the body processes the drug, as well as where the drug actually goes in terms of the tumour and what effect it's having on the biology of the cancer.
So how do you evaluate whether a treatment is actually working?
So I think there are 2 points here. So for an individual patient, and ultimately when I'm seeing a patient in clinic, they want to know whether the drug is working for them. So for an individual patient taking part in a trial, patients are monitored very closely to ensure their safety. Their cancer is assessed frequently, and usually we repeat scans every 2 to 3 months to make sure they're benefiting from treatment. For the trial as a whole, it can take much longer to know if the treatment is going to be successful. And that's because it takes time to carefully evaluate all of the data we collect from all of the patients. In very early phase trials, we only treat a small number, as I mentioned. In later phase trials, we need a much larger population of patients to prove that the drug is better than the existing treatments. And as such, it can often take a long time to find enough patients and get them all through the trial, then analyse all the results to actually know whether the treatment is effective.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to coordinate with other cities, other countries, to make sure that all happens.
Absolutely. The trials are often, very international. I obviously work within Manchester, but we have a network of cancer centres in the UK, but we actually work globally with cities and sites across the world. It's really important to remember that.
Yeah. So Diane, sorry you've been left out all this time. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you first got diagnosed with cancer?
Well, I was diagnosed 15 years ago now, back in 2001. I'm one of 4 sisters, and we always knew that there was possibly something genetic in our family makeup, because my mum, her mum, and my grandma's sister all died very young from breast cancer. But we didn't know what it was, so we were coming to a genetic clinic, a family history genetic clinic in Manchester, for annual mammograms when we were back in our 30s. And it was after one of them annual mammograms that I got a phone call to say that they'd picked something up in one of my breasts. So I sort of knew right back then that this was the beginning of possibly what my mum went through. I had biopsies, and I actually was diagnosed with ductal carcinoma in situ, which I was told wasn't actually invasive breast cancer. However, I did opt to have a double mastectomy. Had 4 children by then of my own, and I was just trying to increase my chances of surviving, really, and to prevent anything else from happening. So after I embarked on that surgery, I was told by the surgeon that they actually did find a large tumour behind my nipple that hadn't shown up on the mammogram, and that was due to the fact that I was quite young, and obviously the breast tissue is quite dense in young women. So I did do the right thing, but I had to come to terms with that very quickly, because I then had to embark on choosing my first chemotherapy treatment here at the Christie, and basically that was 15 years ago. Obviously, I had a blood test after that enabled the scientists to discover that I was actually a carrier of the BRCA2 gene, and that knowledge helped my sisters to actually be tested and find out that 2 of them also carried the gene, and my eldest sister was actually negative. But my 2 younger sisters were able to use that knowledge to embark on having their own preventative surgery and have been, you know, quite healthy ever since. But yes, it was 15 years ago that I embarked on my first clinical trial at the Christie.
So Diane, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that? Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, by the way. It's lovely of you to join us. When you first joined a clinical trial, can you tell us about that moment? Did your doctor approach you with the suggestion of joining it? Did you find out about it yourself? Just talk us through that process.
Well, when I first arrived to take my treatment, I actually was surprised that I was given a choice of treatments. I mean, certainly I'm not an expert, and I didn't expect to be given a choice. But as Dr. Emma Dean's just told you about, it was probably, it was a long time ago, it was probably a phase 3 trial, because I was offered the standard gold star treatment, but alternatively I was offered a combination of 2 chemotherapies that were suggested that would give me the same result, if not a little bit better. And the way I chose was that the standard treatment was 6 treatments, and the trial treatment was 8 treatments, and I just decided that 8 treatments of poison was going to be more beneficial than 6 treatments. But obviously it wasn't very scientific, but that's how I chose that first clinical trial, and it gave me 7 very well years after that in remission. It was at a later stage, when the cancer returned, that I started to gain my knowledge about my particular disease, especially with it being a genetic disease. And when I started to then ask about certain phase 1 trials, which is when I embarked on my first phase 1, was back in 2010.
So it's really, I mean, yeah, echoing what Emma Smith said, it's, you know, people who join clinical trials, they're actually part of how we pioneer treatments, because without them, you know, you wouldn't have any new treatments. How did you feel joining a clinical trial? Did you feel like you got all the information and support you needed?
Absolutely. Obviously, I found out about things myself first, as much as I could. But once I got to the actual phase 1 oncologist, the information was obviously, I was taught through it. I was given lots of paperwork, which can be a little bit overwhelming, but given lots and lots of time to ask questions, to take the paperwork away, to obviously have time to discuss it with my family, and to come back and make a decision after that. Having said that, it's never a done deal when you get to that stage, because there are strict criteria for going on a phase 1 trial, and I didn't know at that stage whether I actually fit that criteria. So I was excited, but apprehensive in case I didn't fit the criteria. And of course, then there's a very strict protocol that goes with any phase 1 clinical trial, and you have to be prepared to be able to fulfill that protocol. So there's an awful lot to take in and digest, but the actual oncologist in clinical trials and the research nurses are amazing at making sure that you've got everything you need to make an informed decision.
So Diane, it sounds like you had a positive experience during your first clinical trial. Have you participated in more since?
I have, yes. I've been on 3 phase 1 clinical trials in total, and probably 2 phase 3. I have to say, you know, these are not miracle cures. You're part of building the knowledge about your particular disease, but also the latest cutting edge treatments. And I have had 2 phase 1 trials that I've been very lucky to have clinical benefit from. But On the other hand, on the flip side, I've been part of a phase 1 trial that actually didn't do me any good at all. And all I'll say about that is, yes, you monitored very, very closely, and as soon as your first scan shows that, you're taken off it immediately, and you're able then to look at alternative treatments and change a direction. But yes, I've been involved in 3 phase 1 clinical trials to date.
So you mentioned that sometimes a clinical trial might not benefit you. What do you think then the good and the bad sides have been for you during all your clinical trials?
Well, I suppose the good thing ultimately for me and my family is that I'm still here. So I have had clinical benefit, and it is prolonging my life. Having said that, that knowledge that they've learned from me will help other people with a similar genetic makeup maybe to me. So I do get a lot of benefit from thinking about that when I'm down maybe. I suppose the downside to being part of a clinical trial is the amount of journeys you have to make to the hospital, and you're talking about going to an experimental cancer unit, medicine cancer unit, which might not be on your doorstep. So I do travel. I'm very lucky that I have a husband who chauffeurs me around, but that's not always easy when you're maybe unwell, and you have to take all that into consideration. And yes, and sometimes you won't get any clinical benefit from that treatment, but I always turn that into a positive, because that's still a learning curve for the scientists and the doctors. Learning that doesn't work for my particular cancer will prevent somebody else from being trialed on it that potentially won't get any benefit either. So I always try and look at the positives in everything.
How important do you think clinical trials are for patients today and in the future as well? I mean, you kind of touched upon it.
Well, basically, these drugs and new treatments are never going to reach, lots of patients if there isn't a small number of patients willing to step up at the phase 1 stage and say, try it on me. Patients are a very, very important link in the discovery aspect of these new drugs and the building of the knowledge for future generations. And for me in particular, having a genetic cancer that potentially is going to affect my children and their children, I'm always very focused on the fact that I'm happy to be part of that learning process, because my family will benefit in the future, and I'm sure an awful lot of other families will too. So it isn't just about me, it's about the wider aspect of the science and getting these treatments through as soon as possible to the right patients.
Absolutely. I couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Emma Dean, back to you. How do you raise the subject of clinical trials with patients?
For me personally, as a trials doctor, I think we should always think about all of the treatment options that are available for our patients. And this includes conventional treatment with perhaps radiotherapy and chemotherapy, but also includes participation in clinical trials. And it's, of course, really important to remember that many clinical trials do include conventional treatment, given in a new way perhaps, or alongside an experimental drug. As such, it's not really always necessary to think of a trial as an either-or choice. Sometimes you just need to think about it as another choice as part of the treatment journey. Not all patients will wish to take part in a clinical trial, but for me it's about offering that opportunity and accepting that it is the patient's decision, and their care will never be compromised if they choose not to participate.
Okay, sorry, my sound's going a little bit in and out, but hopefully you can still hear me. Just a quick question about the success of clinical trials. Do all clinical trials succeed? And if they don't, does that mean it's been a waste of time and money?
So unfortunately, there is a very high failure rate with drugs in development, and many drugs do not make it through the trials process. However, we are always learning from that process, from drug development. So even if a trial is unsuccessful, we gain a lot of information about cancer, which helps us develop better drugs in the future. For this reason, it's also really important that we actually publish the results of trials, even if they are negative, so that researchers across the globe can learn from the research that we've done.
You make it sound very open and democratic. Is it really that open? Can anyone join a clinical trial?
So it has its challenges recruiting patients to clinical studies, but we always try and find ways for as many patients as possible to participate in trials. However, as Diane has already mentioned, there are very strict criteria for patients to take part. And those criteria exist not to exclude patients, but really to try and minimise the risks for patients taking part in studies of unlicensed and experimental drugs. Essentially, that's what we are giving at the end of the day. It can be very disappointing for patients if they have spoken to their oncologist about taking part in a trial, they've taken time to hear the information, to read the information, and perhaps prepare themselves for taking part and all the tests that are involved. So understandably, it can be very disappointing if we find out that we are unable to place that patient on a study. But if that's not the case, then your patient's own oncologist will be able to discuss about the alternative options, and possibly there may be another trial option which can be considered. Because the criteria are very specific for individual studies, often if one study patients are unsuitable for one study, they can actually be considered for alternative trials.
And this is something I'm just curious about, and feel free to say you don't know if you don't know. But how many cancer patients are currently on clinical trials? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that across the UK as a whole. As a percentage of patients receiving cancer treatment, it's probably in the region of about 15 to 20% that would take part in a trial. That's what our centre figures are approximately around. Some areas in big cancer centres, the figure's likely to be higher than perhaps smaller cancer centres. I think the main thing really is to try and think about trials, and if you're at a centre that perhaps doesn't have a lot of trials, your oncologist will usually be very happy to refer you to have a discussion at another centre, at a specialist centre. So in some instances you won't be able to have treatment locally. You may have to be referred and travel if you want to take part in a trial.
Yeah. And lastly,
I have 2 questions, if I may. Sorry to interrupt you, Buddhini. Do you have any views on the clinical trials looking at kind of aggressive and hard to treat cancers? Because I've heard a kind of lot of anecdotes about just the speed of getting patients onto the trial isn't quick enough, and that we could do a lot to make the process quicker and timelier.
Yeah, I think that's an area that's been recognised as being very challenging in the past, and the regulatory authorities have tried to address that by making it easier to accelerate drugs that are specifically for rare tumours. In those sorts of studies, often they need to be open to a global population, because you're trying to find a rare cancer and you've got a small patient population. So that's really important that the oncology community and that disease area of focus, which may be quite rare, is engaged in that research, so that as many patients are offered that opportunity. But it is challenging, and a lot of drug companies do focus their attentions on the cancer types where more patients are affected.
And lastly, just before we wrap things up, why do you think people should take part in clinical trials? Do you have anything to say to them? Why should patients consider?
Why should patients consider taking part? I think for patients, it's another opportunity for another possible treatment. It may be helpful, it may not be helpful, but it increases the opportunities for treatment. Obviously, the intent for that individual, every individual patient I treat wants to benefit themselves, but also patients take part because they do care about research, they do care about the cancer, making progress in treating cancer. And as you heard from Diane, who spoke brilliantly about the impact she felt taking part has on her family, but also understanding cancer and improving treatments for the future. So what I would say to a patient is just ask. Okay, so firstly, ask your oncologist about taking part in a trial. This can be done at any stage in your treatment, and it's really important to emphasise that. It doesn't matter if you've just been diagnosed or you're actually on treatment at the time you think about it. Just ask, and your oncologist will be able to point you in the right direction or talk to you about that. As I mentioned, some hospitals run lots of trials. Some hospitals may not be able to offer a wide choice of studies and may want to refer you to another centre. Here at the Christie, like many other hospitals, we have a lot of information available on our website. So that's a resource patients can access. Likewise, Cancer Research UK have a website with information about how you go about finding a trial.
Excellent. We're almost up at time. Any final thoughts you both want to share?
I think I just want to finish off by saying, think about trials, ask your oncologist. We're there to try and improve outcomes in patients. So we really want to encourage patients to take part in studies. So please, just ask.
And I would say much the same really as Dr. Emma-Dean. Have that discussion. It gives you another option alongside maybe the options that you've already been presented with. And I've always been a believer that I want to know every option available to me in order to make that informed decision. And you might be surprised that there might be a number of different options for you personally. So don't be afraid, have that discussion and just see if there's another option for you.
And there's a very handy picture behind Diane that explains that, how to find the CRUK clinical trials database. Emma Smith, any final words?
No, I just want to thank both Emma-Dean and Diane for their time. Thank you both. You've put it all brilliantly. I think made it really clear and interesting. And yeah, just as they both said, go and ask. I think clinical trials are a really amazing thing, and it's how we're going to get new treatments out.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you all three of you for the time you take to talk about this. Yeah, see you next time we plan a hangout. Keep an eye on our social media accounts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.